Honourable Member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it's my privilege to rise today to speak on C-10. It's before this House, and to join the debate today. And this is one of those unique circumstances where the opposition in many ways is united in parts, and in some ways speaking with a unified voice, but for different reasons perhaps. But in many ways, this debate's an interesting one for me, given my background in the Air Force, Mr. Speaker. My background as a lawyer, which in my early days, articling as a first-year lawyer, I was involved in the CCAA restructuring of Air Canada. And that was a time where Canadians worried about losing our flagship carrier, Mr. Speaker. And the company successfully restructured under CCAA. That protected a lot of jobs, a lot of commercial relationships across the country, and it protected the airline, Mr. Speaker. We all remember years where there was many more serving the country, companies like Canadian, Wardair. It shows how globally competitive this industry is, Mr. Speaker, and I was very proud as a young lawyer to be involved acting at a firm that represented Air Canada in that restructuring many years ago. Its heritage, Mr. Speaker, as a former Crown corporation, is really why we're here with C-10, an act to amend the Air Canada Public Participation Act, which was a creature of the privatization. And most of the comments from my NDP friends along the way relate to the commitments made back in 1987 and 88 when this Crown corporation was privatized. And I don't even think my Liberal friends would suggest that the industry is the same today as it was in 1988. So to suggest even the members of the unions they're talking about are performing the same tasks on the same type of aircraft would be false, because certainly the industry has changed in terms of technology, in terms of the needs of the workforce, in terms of the globalization of the supply chain, Mr. Speaker. So we have to have these debates in the Commons. Where I'm united with my concern with my NDP friends is really how this debate is coming to the floor. And in many ways, this new Liberal government is showing that the old ways, and in fact the ways a lot of Canadians disliked about the Liberal governments of the past, appear to be back. When deals are made to benefit, special interests or certain groups, and a full discussion of the public policy ramifications of an issue aren't actually spoken about. And I'm going to raise a few of these points in relation to the debate here at C-10 because I think they're important, Mr. Speaker. In many ways, the Liberals, prove that old adage, why take one position on an issue when you can take two positions on an issue politically and advance both? And here is one that the Liberal Party, most of the Liberal Party at the time in the 1980s, opposed privatization of Air Canada. At the time, the Mulroney government proceeded with that privatization. Yet here they're sneaking in an amendment to the participation aspects and sort of the job guarantees provided in the 1980s with limited discussion, no real mention in their election document, which they hold sacrosanct in all other aspects of what they're doing in their early days, and we're here as a result of it. It's also the result of their bad policy decision with respect to the Toronto Island Airport and the fact that a private sector operator was looking at buying a Bombardier aircraft at a time that Bombardier was seeking government assistance. There was a private sector purchaser, but because of a small and very influential within their caucus lobby group in downtown Toronto, they circumvented the regulatory process looking at the expansion of a regional airport. That is not just a decision made in isolation, Mr. Speaker, because our transportation networks are integrated, and what happens on Billy Bishop will impact Hamilton, will impact the airport in Kitchener-Waterloo, will impact Pearson, will impact the Pickering Airport and what size that takes in the future, Mr. Speaker. So these decisions can't be taken in isolation, but they stop the expansion applications and review for the Toronto Island, thereby eliminating a private sector sale for Bombardier at a time that they're teetering. Yet, behind C-10, Mr. Speaker, is really a deal, I believe, that was crafted by the federal government in relation to another purchaser acquiring said aircraft and coming to the rescue, so to speak. And I would like the minister to bring to this House, was this discussed, was C-10 discussed as an element of the private sector sale to Bombardier that we see Air Canada announcing? Because the announcement came mere days, Mr. Speaker, after that company met with the minister. So what someone needs to do is really just connect the dots on all this and see that what led up to C-10, the reason it wasn't in the election platform of the Liberal government was because it has come about as a result of the challenges Bombardier is facing. That is my concern, Mr. Speaker. We need to have a full debate with a full discussion of the impact of Bombardier's financial difficulties alongside sales of aircraft and alongside litigation that several other provinces were party to in relation to the Air Canada Public Participation Act, Mr. Speaker. C-10 is a small bill in terms of the number of words, but when you peel the onion on the issues underlying this, as all members of the opposition have been doing today, you see there's a lot more to this bill than the couple of pages that it appears to represent. And the government has not been transparent on that at all. For a government that had their hallmark being transparency in sunny ways, we see that jettisoned on most issues within weeks, Mr. Speaker. So in my remarks, I'm going to explore why I think these underlying public policy decisions relate to what's before us in C-10. And that's why I have serious concerns with C-10, Mr. Speaker, is the government has not been transparent on the road that has us here, considering this amendment to a long-standing act and a long-standing practice. I'm also proud, as I said, as a former officer of the RCAF, very proud of our aerospace industry, Mr. Speaker, very proud of Bombardier, proud of Air Canada, our carriers, proud of the suppliers, which are world-class. And that's why when the government made a quick move to scuttle the expansion of Toronto Island without proper consultation, that impacts our industry, which is world-class. A lot of Canadians don't realize that Canada was the third nation in space with Alouette 1. Canada basically trained most of the pilots of the free world that won World War II with the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. On the weekend, Mr. Speaker, I played the Honourable George Hees, John Diefenbaker's transport minister, at a recreation of the Avro Aero dinner, Mr. Speaker, and we celebrated aerospace and our achievements. Diefenbaker himself wasn't celebrated at this dinner because he did cancel the Aero, Mr. Speaker. But we have a tremendous heritage, and the opportunities in this industry are really not well known by Canadians. We remain the #1 producer from an R&D and a production standpoint of flight simulators around the world. When I was in Seoul as the Parliamentary Secretary for International Trade, Mr. Speaker, in the previous government, I toured CAE's simulator just outside Seoul, providing flight training and aircrew training for Asian airlines, Mr. Speaker. We were there as part of the South Korean trade agreement. That's a company with a global reputation as the best in the business, and we should celebrate that. Canada remains the #3 producer in terms of aircraft production, small and medium-sized aircraft, with a new larger one on the horizon with Bombardier. That will again be best in class, Mr. Speaker. We're third in engine production for civilian or civil air purposes, Mr. Speaker. These are incredible numbers. They're all well-paying, all highly skilled and high-trade jobs, Mr. Speaker, and they're all trade-focused. So at a time where our dollar is lower and we have the ability to trade very competitively, we should be taking advantage of leveraging this industry, not secret deals that actually hold it back. $28 billion in revenue across the companies within this sector, both in the supply chain and production and in manufacturing, Mr. Speaker, and 76,000 jobs across the country in all provinces, but with particularly well-regarded and highly concentrated industries in the Montreal area, in Winnipeg, in Toronto, also in mainland BC as well, Mr. Speaker. So these are jobs we should foster, we should work with, and our previous government did in terms of reforming research and development. In fact, the Red Wilson report the previous government outlined to make sure we constantly looked at our competitiveness. Red Wilson had been a leader, a corporate leader at CAE, Mr. Speaker. And it's worth noting some of these companies, and I have a particular passion for them, not just because I'm ex-Air Force, but because I'm ex-Minister of Veterans Affairs. A lot of them are veteran employers, Mr. Speaker. Very, very in some cases, their senior leadership are veterans. McDonald Detweiler and Associates, the famed Canada arm, Mr. Speaker, in space, probably our biggest iconic R&D development. Viking Air, which has recreated some of the old classic de Havilland aircraft that have been flying for generations. Cascade, Avcorp, Bombardier, CAE, Comdev. And of course, we also have global companies producing in Canada, companies like Boeing, Canada's companies like General Dynamics, companies like Lockheed Martin, through our industrial regional benefits programs, Mr. Speaker, that provide supply sector jobs as a result of our defence purchases, which at times with this government seem somewhat uncertain. But if something is acquired, there is money put into research and development, to jobs on the ground here. And I think that supply chain is critical, Mr. Speaker, and why our industry here does have to modernize. So we do have to have a debate on the ground about public participation, about the industry, so that our manufacturers, including some of the businesses I named, not just take advantage of servicing for Air Canada or WestJet or Porter. They really need to be involved in the global supply chain for both maintenance and production, Mr. Speaker. So what are we here for on C-10? We've heard a lot of passion on the side of members of the New Democratic Party, but it boils down to really three subtle changes to the Act, which came in as a result of the privatization of Air Canada in 1988. One, and it's amending Section 6(1)(d) of that Act, changing the maintain, operations, and overhaul description of securing jobs as they stood in the 1980s into carry out or cause to be carried out, which kind of recognizes that a lot of specialized manufacturers, whether it's landing gear or components, they can provide that specialized maintenance, that life cycle maintenance that's important in the airline industry, Mr. Speaker. And that specialization can happen through the carrying out. So that actually makes sense, Mr. Speaker, in this environment, but you haven't heard that because of the secret deals that has brought us to C-10. The operation and overhaul has been expanded to certainly show that it includes any type of work related to airframes, engines, component parts, mainly because we have some expertise on a subcomponent basis in Canada in terms of some of the leading producers. And the geographic areas protected back in 1988 with the privatization, which at that time were described as the city of Winnipeg, the city of Mississauga, and the Montreal urban area, because I think they needed to describe that in a wider sense. The new amendments proposed in C-10 would just refine that to the provinces as opposed to those cities proper, Mr. Speaker. So the substance of C-10, in some ways, recognizes the fact that the industry is not the same industry it was in 1988. And I can certainly understand why Air Canada probably wants to be unshackled from the requirements put on in 1988 to make sure that the privatization wasn't too disruptive. And if you look at the airline as it stands today, it's strong and a global leader in many ways, Mr. Speaker, but it's also subject to global competition and has to be able to take advantage of the same expertise and opportunity. So if you're going to carry out or cause to be carried out in a certain part of Canada, as long as you're getting that best-in-class ability to maintain and modernize fleets, that's really what we want to see. The other thing I said, Mr. Speaker, at the outset that has us here in this debate today that the government hasn't been transparent on is the fact that C-10 is really the result of litigation in relation to adherence to this Act. And as I said, Air Canada probably understandably feels unfairly shackled by something that was done not just by the last government or the previous government, 3 governments ago in the 1980s at a time where privatizations were, a little new. But I think today, most Canadians would certainly not expect the federal government to operate their airline in a competitive environment where there's lots of choice, Mr. Speaker. In Quebec, Quebec and Manitoba, I should say, joined the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers in litigation related to business changes in those jurisdictions. And certainly with that union involved, that's why my friends in the NDP are as passionate. And I respect their standing up for workers and items they believe. But I would suggest that their workers would tell them that this is not the same industry that it was in 1988. But what we saw was both Quebec dropping its participation, the government of Quebec dropping its participation in this litigation as a result of an Air Canada decision to purchase aircraft. So obviously there was some political horse trading that went on, and the Quebec government removed itself from this litigation in return for Air Canada supporting the industry through the acquisition of Bombardier aircraft. Manitoba, Mr. Speaker, also removed itself from this litigation by carving out a deal where Air Canada supported 3 world-class aerospace services suppliers in Manitoba and leased one of the Air Canada maintenance hangars to an operator in Manitoba, Mr. Speaker, on favorable terms. So in that case, there was another provincial government coming up with a deal they thought was sound to remove themselves from a civil action in relation to an act from the 80s. As I said at the outset of my remarks, I would have much preferred the Minister of Transport to come to this House and tell us that C-10 is the result of yet another pragmatic deal that was made. But to do that, you'd have to outline all aspects of that deal, Mr. Speaker, and what exactly happened, and did the government approach a private sector player to help it with respect to requests from Bombardier for assistance? Because I think this is where we get into some difficult territory, Mr. Speaker. Should the government be convening these meetings behind closed doors to cobble out a position, particularly when the minister was getting heat for ending the exploration of expansion of the Toronto Island Billy Bishop Airport and cancelled that with a tweet, Mr. Speaker, after demands from people within his caucus and within a group in Toronto advocating against an expansion, Mr. Speaker. What that cancellation led to was a private sector company that was planning an acquisition of Bombardier aircraft. They could no longer proceed. So all of these events gather, Mr. Speaker, and that is the run-up to why we have C-10. So we can't actually have a rational discussion on whether it would be helpful to unshackle a company from requirements that limit its competitiveness from 1988 legislation. We can't have that discussion, and I'd like to, Mr. Speaker, because the minister in this government has not come to the House in an open and transparent way. Much like the parliamentary budget officer said they approached their recent budget, the least transparent in over 15 years, Mr. Speaker. I would like this government to outline all aspects that went into C-10, the related litigation, the pressures in relation to the financial stability of Bombardier, and Air Canada's need to be competitive in a global age. I think we could have a proper debate if that was here before the House, Mr. Speaker. I'm very disappointed that information is not here for this debate. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Transport.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to my honourable member for his comments. And I just wanted to underscore, I wanted to be clear on a couple of points. The government wants Air Canada, which is a private company, to have the flexibility that it needs to manage its business operations in 2016. And we understand that the air transport sector has evolved since 1989 and will continue to evolve. And Air Canada needs the tools and regulatory supports to keep pace. But this must be done within a framework, within maintaining adequate safeguards for Canadian workers and suppliers. And that is why we are proposing to ensure that the Act continues to require Air Canada carry out aircraft maintenance in certain Canadian regions. And that's why we want this Act to proceed to the committee stage so we can hear from stakeholders and get more debate at the committee level. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Parliamentary Secretary for her intervention. I think she could detect from most of my remarks here that it's not the actual policy within C-10 that I have the issue with. It's the road to getting to C-10 that causes me some difficulty, because I do think, as I said at the beginning of my speech, having worked on the restructuring of Air Canada and seen the growth in recent years and the success, and in fact the strong leadership of Kaylin Rovanescu and the team they have, there is a good debate to be had on should they be shackled exactly to the purposes of the 1988 Act. What I would ask her was she part of the meetings on February 15th that the minister took with that company? Because what I'd like to know is, did the minister facilitate this sort of deal, much like the Quebec government facilitated settlement of litigation, much like the Manitoba government facilitated a deal? It's the facilitation that hasn't been explained to this House that's an important part of C-10.
Commentaire, questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Beloeil-Chambly.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je veux remercier mon collègue pour son discours. Évidemment, même si les deux partis du côté de l'opposition s'opposent au projet de loi, nos raisons ne sont pas tout à fait identiques, mais j'aimerais quand même entendre mon collègue un peu sur le changement de cap que les libéraux ont eu dans ce dossier. I had an opportunity to read a quote before. Let's read another one. Let's keep going, digging through the archives of the Transport Committee. So this member says, I do believe in the rule of law. I believe that when an individual or corporation breaks the law, there should be some justice that comes out of it. The workers of Avios, who were formerly Air Canada employees, feel there has not been any justice, that their government has let them down. Then goes on to read the law as it currently exists, before C-10, of course, and then goes on to accuse Air Canada of wanting to privatize, and says, as someone who is concerned about the worker, we read and interpret it as Air Canada is obligated to maintain those overhaul centres. Then Air Canada kind of privatizes and pushes that responsibility over to Avios. A court then makes a decision that because Avios is now there, Air Canada is indirectly keeping those jobs. Who said that, Mr. Speaker? Once again, the member from Winnipeg North is showing us how this Liberal government opposes one way, governs another. I'd like to hear my colleague on that.
Very good. Well, member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his passion on this issue, and we've heard some of his colleagues express the same concerns. I think where we do differ is the progressive Conservative government of Mr. Mulroney, Prime Minister Mulroney, privatized Air Canada, and at the time, the public policy decisions were reflected in the Public Participation Act. And I would think it would be fair for me to say, and I think my friend would agree with me, that the centers of excellence of the aerospace industry, and I mentioned our strengths in that industry, in Montreal, in Winnipeg in particular, and in Toronto, are still quite strong. What has changed is the nature of the global supply chain. So these are the debates we should have in this Commons, not in the court of law, like some of the unions have taken this route, to hold the industry to a frozen moment in time in 1988 would not be prudent. But what we haven't had here is the full discussion that they've had in Quebec or in Winnipeg about how those governments took pragmatic public policy decisions to then remove themselves from litigation related to this act. I think the same thing has happened here. I've outlined in my speech where I think it's happened. I just would prefer if the minister got up and said that to the House.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his excellent speech. I just want to note that there are many other things that the government could be doing that would improve the competitiveness of Air Canada that don't negatively impact workers. For instance, they could raise the foreign ownership threshold. They could work to streamline processes in terms of customs. They could work to align regulations. There are a variety of things that Air Canada has mentioned as contributing to their competitiveness, changes that would help their competitiveness, and this really isn't one of them. So I wonder if the member can speculate as to why the government is moving in this direction and maybe identify, as I have, some of these other alternative ways that we could actually help increase Air Canada's competitiveness.
The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my friend for his question and outlining, yes, that there are a variety of public policy options available to the government. In the previous government, the capital cost allowance acceleration and a variety of other R&D credits and reforms were ways that we were trying to help the manufacturing industries across the country, particularly in my province of Ontario, on a range of industries, Mr. Speaker. And I met regularly with the Aerospace Association and industry in Canada on ways that we could do that in a way to help them. What we see here, as I said earlier in my speech and in previous answers to questions, is something that is really the result of litigation, which is the result of the financial instability of one of those aircraft assemblers, Mr. Speaker. And what we haven't had is a proper talk on that industry. Certainly, having lived in and served in the Air Force in Winnipeg, I know the excellent track record that industry has and global reputation, Mr. Speaker. How can we best facilitate the success of that industry? Some of the policies of the previous government are the answer, as well, Mr. Speaker, letting the regulatory process for airports like the Toronto Island Airport to run its course, and then the private sector will actually help before the government has to come with a bailout.